In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of kind of an interesting group of animals. It's the vertebrates, or also known as the chordates. This group includes a lot of the animals that you're more familiar with. I'm going to just give you kind of a brief overview of each of the groups, and then we're going to spend more time during this next week looking at some specific organisms more in depth. So let's talk about some general characteristics of all vertebrate animals. All have bilateral symmetry, which means that they have a head, they have a specific region with a brain in it, and they have sense organs, most of them in the front of the body in the head area. Like, for instance, your sense of smell, eyes, ears, that kind of stuff. They all have a skeleton that's made of bone, or in some cases just cartilage, which is a sort of a more flexible kind of material, but also will make up a skeleton. And we're talking here about an endoskeleton. Endoskeleton, in other words, inside, an inside skeleton. All of them have a nerve cord running down their back, and all of them have a feeding structure and a breathing structure called a pharynx, where in this case they are sort of connected to one another. So where breathing happens, feeding happens as well, and that's true, of course, in your body because you are a vertebrate animal. There are 8 classes of vertebrates that we're going to discuss. The first group you're probably not as familiar with. These are Agnathans. These are fish with no jaws. They're also known as ostracoderms. They have a skeleton made of cartilage, no bone. They do not have a jaw. They are either parasitic or predatory, so some of them can, sort of hunt and eat things. Most of them will attach themselves to another organism and sort of be a parasite on that organism. The example here is a lamprey. This is the lamprey's mouth. It's sort of like a sucking apparatus where they attach and will draw blood, kind of like a leech, off of another animal. In this case, this is a fish. Oftentimes you'll see lampreys on sharks, and they're parasites on the sharks, but they don't have a jaw with teeth in them. The second class of vertebrates are chondrichthyes. This means cartilage fish. Ichthyes means fish. So these are cartilage fish. These are sharks and rays. They are all marine predators. They have a skeleton made of cartilage, no bone at all in sharks and rays. And they are some of the largest creatures that we find in the ocean. Lots of different sizes. Of course, the whale shark being the largest. You can see how large it is. Thresher shark a little smaller. And we have, of course, rays as well. The next class of vertebrates are osteichthyes. Again, ichthyes means fish. Oste meaning bone. These are the bony fish. These are the most diverse and abundant of all the vertebrates. So there are more fish on the planet than any other organism, any other type of vertebrate, and there are more different kinds of them than any other type of vertebrate. They are highly adapted for life in the water. They're super well adapted for living in the ocean and in fresh water. They have fins for swimming. They have scales, and the scales actually protect them from water loss or from water gain, depending on what kind of environment they live in. They have gills for extracting the oxygen from the water, and oftentimes they'll have this thing called the swim bladder, which helps them to go sort of up and down in the water. It makes them either more buoyant or less buoyant in the water, the swim bladder. The next class of vertebrates are the amphibians. Amphibia means double life or dual life. And so these are frogs, toads, newts, and salamanders. They have a lifestyle and a body that's somewhere in between fish and reptiles. In other words, somewhere between an organism that lives fully in the water and one that lives fully on land. They do have a bony skeleton, and they have 4 limbs. So we saw in fish they had fins, but now amphibians have legs. They are adapted for life on land. But because they're spending a lot of time either in the water or near the water, they breathe through lungs, but they also can breathe through their skin partially. So some of the oxygen they obtain from the atmosphere is coming directly from their skin. And because they are living that dual life, they have to lay eggs in water like fish do. They haven't developed, they don't have the type of egg that can survive out of the water. They don't have any protection for losing water or being protected, from anything that might happen outside of the water. So here we have a newt, here's a toad, and we have a little frog. These are the amphibians. The next class of vertebrates are reptilians. These are snakes, lizards, turtles, and crocodiles, and of course also the dinosaurs, which are all extinct. These guys are well adapted for life on land. So now the amphibians kind of were the ones that moved on to land originally, and then they slowly over time evolved this other way of living where they're more adapted for dealing with not having a watery environment. They have tough, scaly skin, which protects them and prevents water loss. They have internal fertilization. So in the amphibians, the eggs are when they're reproducing, they lay their eggs down in the water, and then the male will come along and lay his sperm down over the eggs. But in reptiles, there's internal fertilization, so the male actually deposits his sperm inside the body of the female, which means that they don't need water. They don't need water to reproduce. They have well-developed kidneys, which helps them, again, live on land. They can sort of monitor how much water they're losing. The kidneys keep track of whether it's important to get rid of some water or whether to retain the water, and kind of monitor dehydration. And then their eggs are developed differently so that they don't need to be in the water. They have something called an amnion. There's an amniotic egg, which is a yolk. So they have a shell around them. In reptiles, it's a leathery shell, not a hard shell like a chicken egg, but it's sort of flexible. And then inside there's the embryo, the little growing reptile, and then attached to it is a food source that we call yolk, but it's a food source for the growing embryo. This is called an amniotic egg, and it's helpful for reptiles because they don't have to lay their eggs in water. And our reptiles, remember, we have lizards like this iguana, we have snakes, and turtles. The next class of vertebrates are the aves. These are the birds. This is a very diverse group, not quite as diverse as the fish, but there are many, many different kinds of birds, and they all look very different. They descended from reptiles, as we've talked about in class, probably from one of the groups of dinosaurs, and they share characteristics with the reptiles, such as laying eggs. The major innovation we see in birds is feathers. Feathers allow birds to fly, so they give them control over flight and give them sort of the lift they need to fly. They also help conserve heat, so birds are better at dealing with cold environments, for instance, where you don't find a lot of reptiles or amphibians where it's cold, but a lot of birds can survive. And they help birds to communicate with each other. So a lot of times birds will have coloration to their feathers that allows them to communicate with one another, all kinds of things. Here are some examples. Of course, we have an owl, we have a little songbird, and we have a parrot here. And parrots oftentimes will congregate together based on color, and they recognize each other based on color, so the feathers are important. Finally, the last class of vertebrates are the mammals. These include placental mammals, marsupial mammals, and monotreme mammals. Placental mammals are the ones probably you're most familiar with, like dogs and cats and horses and people. They have their young in a uterus, and there's an attached placenta inside the uterus with the embryo that nourishes the embryo. That's called placental mammals. And then we have marsupial mammals, which give birth to their young in a very undeveloped state, a really tiny, tiny little embryo, and then it emerges, and then it crawls up inside of a pouch and latches on and finishes its development inside the pouch of the mother. Those are called marsupial mammals, like a kangaroo or a koala. And then finally, there's a smaller group of mammals called monotremes, and they're sort of strange because they lay leathery eggs like a reptile would lay. But they're still considered mammals because they nurse their young with milk, and they have fur. So a mammal's body is covered in fur or hair. That's one characteristic. They give birth to live young, with the exception of the monotremes. All the rest give birth to live young. They don't lay eggs. And they nurse their young on milk that's produced in a structure called a mammary gland. So these are all of our characteristics of the mammal. Here's just a bunch of different mammals. We have an elephant, our marsupial mammal, the kangaroo. We have a primate. This is a chimpanzee. And then here are the two monotremes. We have a duckbill platypus and the spiny echidna. So that is our vertebrate groups. And that's all I have for this one. We're going to explore these in more depth in class.